We can always tell. If you spent any sort of time in or around the trans community, you've likely heard the saying uttered by anti-trans fascists. It's the assertion that no matter what a trans person does to align their appearance with how they perceive themselves, anti-trans bigots have some innate ability to tell who is and is not trans. And whilst it can be fun to make light of this assertion by acknowledging the many times trans people have passed undetected around gender-critical fascists, often as part of a protest, said narrative has resulted in very real harm, both for trans people and cis people, as we'll see whilst discussing today's incident. But first, a quick content warning for the following: transmisogyny, transmisandry, misgendering, incarceration, sexual violence, psychological torture, and suicide. If our work has helped you, please consider supporting us via Patreon so that we can keep the channel running. You can also help us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. Hi there, my name is Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and we're here to talk about a recent case in which an alleged cis woman was sent to a men's prison, seemingly for no other reason than they were viewed as having masculine features by the people who processed them, only to then later be sent to a woman's prison, at which point it came to light that they were, in fact, Transmasc. This story was broken by The Telegraph, who reported that the unnamed person was sent to HMP Perth in Scotland, where they were kept overnight, even after the legal system realised its error. As the Telegraph source told the paper, quote, "This is a complete embarrassment for everyone involved. Taking a female to a male prison and leaving her there is a shocker. An assumption was made, based on someone's appearance and not much else. Gender in the prison system has become such a hot topic that management will be mortified by this. It was only when the more thorough search was carried out by prison staff that it came to light that the prisoner was missing some vital parts you might expect a man to have. The woman was whisked away to segregation overnight, and the questions immediately started getting asked about how this could have happened." End quote. Something that really sticks out to me about this is the preoccupation with how the incident will reflect badly on the legal system, rather than, the harm inflicted upon said person. Because yes, the very act of being stripped of your gender is violence, especially when carried out by the state, irrespective of whether the individual is trans or not. Being stripped of your gender is like being stripped of your name. It's a way of ripping your identity away from you, making you powerless to control your own personhood. It's extremely dehumanizing. The legal system as currently exists in the UK is already intrinsically violent, meaning this already extreme violence is being compounded. I also can't help but notice the childishness of the Telegraph source, how they resort to euphemisms such as parts you might expect a man to have. As an adult, you can just say they lacked a penis or even a phallus. The fact that people involved with our legal system can't even bring themselves to name certain body parts is deeply troubling, to say the least. Euphemisms are, by very definition, language which is designed to make the speaker and/or listener comfortable. It's designed to cushion the blow of what's actually taking place here, someone being physically groped and then judged solely on the basis of whether or not the groper finds a penis, turning said assault into a joke. It's also cisnormative in the declaration that you'd expect a man to have a penis. You'd only think that way if you view trans people to be unworthy of consideration or acknowledgement. This is the source tacitly admitting to the bias that caused this problem in the first place, the very same bias seen when they explicitly label said person a woman, forcing said human being into their arbitrary binary. It's also extremely hypocritical in how they want to dictate the lives of trans people on the basis of genitals, yet are completely unwilling to say penis or vulva. It really underscores the childlike repulsion towards the human body that fascism loves to tap into and weaponize against marginalized people. It certainly underscores the cruel incompetence seen throughout the legal system. I'm just really sorry for this person and how much they've already been dehumanized by the system in being passed back and forth like a slab of meat. I doubt they'll get the support they need, but I hope there's at least some form of justice that comes from this. I know a review on the incident has been opened, but that's asking the people responsible to assess themselves. The sad fact is, our legal system isn't exactly known for justice as much as it might like to pretend otherwise. Of course, this isn't where the story ends. For whilst the Telegraph and almost all other papers reported on the incident as a cis woman being sent to a men's prison, one paper, the Scottish Daily Record, actually identified the individual in question as 25-year-old Nathan Johnston. As for Johnston's gender, the paper doesn't say, merely telling us that, quote, Johnston, 25, from Fife, understood to be a trans male, a person born female, was taken to women's jail, Cornton Vale, the next day. End quote. Which, on top of being an incredibly transmisic definition of trans male, in that it declares Transmasc folk as being born female rather than assigned, is also incredibly ambiguous in just how broad it is, including every single AFAB trans person. At the time of writing this, we still don't know whether or not Johnston is a binary trans man, non-binary trans man, or non-binary transmasc person, let alone what their pronouns are. All we do know is that they are transmasc. This adds an extra layer of complexity to an already complicated case. On the one hand, Johnston is still undergoing the very same violence as if they'd been a cis woman, only rather than spending a single night in a men's prison, they've now been inside a woman's prison for almost a month, something that has almost certainly resulted in some degree of psychological harm, and likely also targeted violence due to them being visibly trans and obviously not a woman. That said, some transmasc folk might argue this to be the lesser violent outcome, owing to fears of anti-trans and, for lack of a better word, anti-AFAB violence by cis men, including sexual violence such as corrective rape. It is a sad fact that, in the UK, cis men are more likely to view trans people negatively and even with open hostility than cis women, and there is no reason to think that this would be any different inside the prison system. There are also many reasons why cis men would uniquely target trans masks. For example, trans men prove that someone can be a man despite being assigned female at birth, which challenges cis men's sense of inborn superiority, potentially motivating them to put trans masks in their place or remind them of their true gender. Cis men are also often raised with a sense of entitlement to women's bodies, which, as a result of being based on violence against cis women, not only extends to all women, but also people who are AFAB. Many transmasc may also avoid men's prisons due to the risk of pregnancy. Pregnancy and childbirth are difficult at the best of times, let alone while suffering additional trauma from rape and dysphoria, and being housed in a facility which is not at all equipped for obstetric care. This puts transmasc in a catch-22, where they either pick psychological violence and degradation via misgendering in being placed in a women's prison, a fact that will almost certainly be used to undermine their personhood, or they pick physical, sexual, medical, and psychological violence in being placed inside a men's prison. The result of which is that, unlike trans women who would almost always prefer a woman's prison, transmasc really cannot win under the current prison system. Not until we come up with better alternatives that do away with said violence, as we should all be working towards anyway. Now, whether Johnston would prefer to be in a men's prison or a woman's prison, we don't know. It's possible that they didn't alert the prison staff to the fact that they were trans because they wanted to be in a male prison, only to be found out during the search, or it's possible that they did mention that they were trans, yet the prison staff assumed they meant trans woman, and thus set on putting them inside a men's prison to try and maximize the systemic violence involved. In the exact same way they have been degendered, first by the prison and then the press, that information has been withheld from the public, which underscores a very real danger in relying on the UK press and prison system to accurately report on systemic violence against trans people. Both systems seem gauged to maximize violence whilst also isolating victims, ensuring that they cannot access advocacy and support. Yet returning to the Telegraph article, another thing that struck me is the whole "how could this have happened?" Again, operating from the assumption that this person was a cis woman who was sent to a men's prison rather than a Transmasc individual, as was later revealed. Thing is, we know why the initial incident and subsequent violence happened. This happened because of anti-trans rhetoric pumped out by far-right groups such as For Women Scotland, promoted and enabled by papers such as The Telegraph. The chickens have come to roost, and they are laying some toxic eggs. There has been an ongoing campaign to present trans people, specifically those assigned male at birth, as intrinsically predatory. This really kicked off in 2015 following a spate of anti-trans bills across the US, which argued that trans-inclusive bathrooms would empower predators to break into schools and rape little girls.
Houston's Proposition 1 bathroom ordinance. What does it mean to you? Any man at any time could enter a woman's bathroom simply by claiming to be a woman that day. No one is exempt. Even registered sex offenders could follow women or young girls into the bathroom, and if a business tried to stop them, they'd be fined. Protect women's privacy. Prevent danger. Vote no on the Proposition 1 bathroom ordinance. It goes too far.
Ads like these would come to define the narratives surrounding trans people for the next few years, as seen in this almost identical campaign run in 2018.
What does Massachusetts Question 3 mean to you? It means any man who says he is a woman can enter a woman's locker room, dressing room, or bathroom at any time, even convicted sex offenders. And if you see something suspicious and say something to authorities, you could be the one arrested and fined up to $50,000. Vote no on 3. This bathroom bill puts our privacy and safety at risk. It goes too far.
And whilst we have actual peer-reviewed science that proved definitively that trans-inclusive bathrooms were no more dangerous than bathrooms that excluded trans people, because no shit, a rapist doesn't give two craps about what's legal and what isn't, they're a rapist, that fact didn't matter. The narrative stuck around, creeping overseas and into other areas of life, such as sports and prisons, framing every trans woman as a predator, lying about their gender to gain access to vulnerable women. And what said narratives brought with them was entirely predictable. We have multiple cases of cis women, just like the alleged cis woman at the center of today's story, mostly lesbian and black women as well as those suffering from alopecia or other conditions, being targeted and even assaulted because the aggressors believed that they were trans women. This is a widespread phenomenon that was reported on as far back as 2016. Contrary to the narrative, anti-trans fascists cannot always tell, a fact that has historically led them to hurt the very people they're pretending to care about. And no, Transmasc are not spared from said violence. When gender-critical fascists campaign to restrict women's spaces to people who were assigned female at birth, they have no intention of letting trans men, trans boys, or non-binary people in, and they are more than happy to attack them for failing to perform femininity correctly or at all. They have been very careful to insist that female means gender-conforming feminine woman, no exceptions. This strips Transmasc of the option to use women's spaces to protect them from the danger posed by cis men, the very same danger gender-critical fascists pretend to care about. In addition to this, gender-critical fascists also demand that we force people into men's or women's spaces based on their birth-assigned gender, forcing Transmasc into women's spaces and giving gender-critical fascists an excuse to attack them for their invasion. We saw this with Mac Beggs, a trans boy wrestler who wanted to compete against other boys, was denied, and was subsequently attacked for invading women's spaces. That's why I have no doubt in my mind that the papers would have done the same to Nathan Johnston had they not lied by reporting them as a cis woman. And the article itself even acknowledges the role of gender-critical narratives in this incident, though it fails to follow through on how the violence inflicted upon countless cis women and Transmasc folk is the fault of that very same rhetoric. The article notes that Scotland rewrote its policies on trans inmates, shifting from a system that defaulted to placing trans people in prisons in line with their actual gender to one which placed them in prisons in line with their incorrectly assigned gender, following public outcry surrounding convicted rapist Isla Bryson. To be absolutely clear, Isla Bryson is a monster, as with all sexual predators. But it needs to be noted that said sexual predators include cis women. Because yes, cis women can be predators as well. Back in 2002, whilst female prisons only accounted for around 6% of the prison population in the UK, they accounted for 12% of all sexual assaults that occurred in prisons. Now, this number has since equalised with male prisons, but it still highlights the important facts that cis women are also rapists. This, of course, fails to factor in how violence against LGBT+ folk, particularly trans people, would likely affect those numbers, bringing us back to that catch-22 mentioned earlier. And I get that my usage of the word rape here, a term which in the UK legally refers to sexual assault involving penetration by a penis, will anger certain people. Thing is, I don't give a shit. As a person who was raped as a 6-year-old child inside a domestic violence refuge, violence that occurred and went undetected largely because it was assumed to be an entirely safe area due to a complete absence of cis men, I take problem with any language which pretends like sexual assault by one means is inherently worse than another. It doesn't matter whether penetration was involved or not, and it certainly doesn't matter whether you were penetrated by a penis, fingers, or another foreign object. Rape is rape, and the UK would be better in reflecting said fact via its language, as far more civilized nations have already done. It would also do better in acknowledging that, just because a person can engage in rape, that doesn't justify cruel and unusual punishment. In the same way that it would be horrific to send a hypothetical cis woman to a men's prison, regardless of what her crimes were, the same is true of trans people. To put a woman in a men's prison and a man inside a women's prison is to inflict gender dysphoria, i.e. psychological harm, which constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. A better way of handling the issue would be to isolate sexually violent inmates to their own section of the prison, both trans and cis, as some places already do. Now, that likely won't be enough to solve the issue, that will require deep-rooted systemic change. But it's a start. Fact is, this violent incident only occurred because it is violence people have been taught is acceptable when inflicted upon trans women, ignorant of how it harms both cis women and trans men, much in the same way that society has been taught that sexual violence is an acceptable punishment for all inmates. We need to tackle both forms of violence, the psychological violence in systemic misgendering/degendering, and sexual violence. And I know it's difficult for many people to care about prisoners, particularly rapists. Believe me, I get it. Just see the reasons mentioned earlier. Yet, as someone who was raped as a child, I don't want to psychologically torture someone, stripping them of their human rights in the process. Not the cis woman who did it to me, not anyone else, cis or trans. Human rights are not a reward for good behaviour, they're intrinsic rights belonging to all people. And yes, that includes rapists. But it gets even worse when we acknowledge the fact that said torture isn't limited to convicted rapists, but is instead inflicted upon all trans prisoners. Little side story, you might have seen this photo of me kicking around. It's being used by some anti-trans bigots in their thumbnails. I think it's because it looks like I'm giving a sermon and they like presenting me as some sort of cult leader. What the photo actually depicts was me on the verge of tears as I gave a talk at Reading University for Trans Day of Remembrance on the 20th of November 2015, just a week after the state murder of Vikki Thompson. Vikki was a trans woman who had grown up in and out of care her entire life. She lacked every available opportunity and, as a result, turned to shoplifting to make ends meet. She was put on probation, but without support, that merely acted as a delay before she was sent to prison, a male prison, in spite of her crime being non-violent in nature. It should be noted, this wasn't her first time in a male prison, with her having been raped repeatedly the last time. As her inmates began making threats against her, talking about visiting her in her cell, Vikki told staff that if she was kept there, she'd leave in a box. The prison staff, having normalized rape as an extension of the prison system, their workplace, chose to do nothing to protect her. Vikki was found hanged in her cell on the 13th of November, killed by the state's inaction, condemned to death for shoplifting. This is an example of the two-tier system for trans people in the UK when it comes to law, how even small crimes often come with the death penalty, or worse. Myself and others made it our job to tell people about her tragic death, leading her name to be adopted as a rallying cry to change the prison system. So to see that policy reversed in Scotland, resulting in the harm of another trans person, it's soul-crushing. It really is. In spite of what the Telegraph's headline might pretend, masculine features didn't cause this violence, nor did the person turning out to be Transmasc. Let's put the blame where it actually belongs, with the institution processing this human being and the spiteful ideology that created the current atmosphere of fear and suspicion that treats every trans woman as inherently predatory and every trans man as a defective female body seeking to maximize violence against both. That's who's to blame, which is why the gender-critical movement has to lie at every turn. Usually when prisoners come up, gender-critical fascists roll out the facts that there is a disproportionate number of sex offenders among trans people. The trick here, however, is the fact that sex offender and violent sex offender are two separate things. Sexual offences include things such as prohibited sex work, such as street soliciting, sharing a building with another sex worker, or advertising sex work. Many of these restrictions are designed specifically to harm sex workers or make sex work unsafe, which in turn forces sex workers to violate said laws, which is then invoked as justification by police to target them. If you'd like to know more about the harm caused by such restrictions, a few of which are shared by the Nordic model, do check out our video, Anti-Trans Feminist Targets Mass Rape Victim, specifically the chapter Julia Long Seeks to Hurt Sex Workers. Fact is, trans people are highly stigmatized and discriminated against at all levels of life, including employment, putting them at greater risk of financial insecurity. This greater insecurity means that they are more likely to turn to sex work as a stable source of income, meaning all trans people, though particularly trans women, are overrepresented among sex workers. Add this to the harmful regulations that many sex workers have to breach in order to stay safe, and you wind up with more trans women being charged for sexual offences without being charged for violent crime. There's also over-policing of trans people in how they're profiled as sex workers, enabling police to allocate more resources towards targeting them, especially trans women, leading to more arrests and charges, leading to an overrepresentation in statistics, feeding a vicious cycle that gets reported on as if it was some intrinsic phenomenon. Do see Stuart Hall's Policing the Crisis, Mugging the State and Law and Order for more on that. I have never had a gender-critical fascist even attempt to respond to these facts. I've never had one return with statistics on violent crimes specifically, just silence. Which is something I wish I could say about the far-right group, For Women Scotland, who, in the article, took to some good old victim blaming in asserting that said incident demonstrated the dangers of, quote, sloppy record keeping and reporting of sex, end quote, as opposed to gender, adding that, quote, they have to stop being frightened of recording a person's sex. Sex should be recorded on every sheet the police give to the prison service, and the prison service should be asking for that. This woman has definitely been put at risk. It's incredibly dangerous for any woman to be in a male prison, end quote. Erasing said trans person's identity and clearly acting as if the trans community is to blame for said violence, and not, them, the people who fought for this very thing in spite of the trans community warning them that this would happen at every point. Again, we've known the harm caused by their fear-mongering and always tell rhetoric for almost a decade. Though I can see why FWS is so desperate to promote this lie. They, as with all gender-critical fascists, have largely gone unchallenged by the public by pretending to fight for the safety of women and girls, in spite of the constant harm they inflict upon everyone. A narrative they're helped in selling by papers such as The Telegraph, who, again, in spite of acknowledging the change of policy brought about by the backlash led by groups such as FWS, refused to connect the dots on the source of the harm. They instead gave FWS free rein to spread the very nonsense that caused this in the first place. This article really is an indictment of UK journalism. And it's not like this is an isolated incident. Remember that photo I showed earlier of a female runner with alopecia being targeted with anti-trans hate in 2023? Just last month, she was made the victim of a similar hate incident whilst using the bathroom in an airport, sharing her story to Twitter, receiving an outpouring of support from me and the rest of the trans community. At least, she did, until she let slip the fact that she herself supports the narratives that led her to be targeted in the first place. And whilst it's horrific for anyone to be made the victim of an anti-trans hate incident, it really goes to show just how much these people are willing to hurt cis women, including themselves, just so they can hurt trans people in the process, only to then turn around and blame trans people for the natural consequences of their own actions. It also reminds me of the recent updates surrounding Noelyn van Leuven, a trans dart player who has been wrapped in controversy for playing in women's tournaments, with people claiming that she has some biological advantage and should thus compete with men. Again, we're talking about bloody darts. Well, as if things couldn't get any more absurd, those very same people are now angry that she's competing against men, doing the very thing they demanded, just like the case of Mac Beggs before her. It really does highlight just how bad faith gender-critical fascists are, how it's not their goal to exclude trans women from women's spaces, it's to exclude trans people from public life, period, and that needed to be called out. Bringing things back to Nathan Johnston, gender-critical fascists and the UK press are not the only ones at fault. We are also to blame. Cis feminists and the broadly white trans community have both created a culture of silence when it comes to Transmasc issues. In all the years of us exposing the prison system's violence against trans people and crying out for change, Have you ever seen someone talk about the dangers Transmascs face before now? Have you even seen someone mention Transmascs? Is it realistic to expect the prison system, with all its violence and bigotry, to treat Nathan Johnston with proper dignity, respect, and protection when we don't even know what Transmasc prisoners need? And it's not just the prison system that we ignore. Fact is, as a community, we refuse to engage anytime a Transmasc is a victim of violence or discrimination. I remember covering the police murder of black trans man Tony McDade in 2020, along with how gender-critical fascist Fred Sargent openly celebrated said murder. That video received a fraction of the attention our other videos at that time received, particularly videos centering on the death of a member of our community. Yes, racism undeniably played a part, but so did Tony McDade being a trans man. Because we've already decided that Transmascs can't face unique violence, so we should focus exclusively on cis and trans women instead. And when a Transmasc does suffer violence unlike anything we've ever seen, we tell ourselves that it's not systemic but an isolated incident, so we don't need to care. On the other hand, we're constantly speaking out when cis women are harmed by transmisogyny, even cis women who hate us, as seen earlier. Can we criticize the press for lying about Nathan Johnston's gender if we ourselves refuse to care about Transmascs? My first version of this video, in which I mistook Johnston for a cis woman, was set to become the most successful video I have ever made. Take a look down at the views on this video and ask yourself, is this video even close to that? As a community, we're happy to accept that cis women suffer violence that trans women don't because they were AFAB. But we call it misogynistic and transmisogynistic when Transmascs say the same. We attack them, harass them, and insist that they have the same privilege as any other, that is, cis, man. We water down their oppression to plain transmisia, and then claim that non-trans mascs have the same experiences, so we may as well focus on them instead. Can we be surprised that Nathan Johnston doesn't have any support, when even the trans community will not support Transmascs? As a community, we deny Transmascs language. When they take it upon themselves to create their own supports, spaces, and theories, we come crashing in and tell them that they're being offensive and violent towards women, that they need to support women more, and that they're speaking over women. We pretend like Transmascs creating their own spaces to talk about such issues is akin to the MRAs of Gamergate, crashing discourse about violence against women. Meanwhile, we don't even have a word for violence against people who are AFAB. The closest one we have is misogyny, which misgenders Transmascs and is constantly used to appropriate their oppression. It's borderline impossible for us to acknowledge the violence against Nathan Johnston, even for those of us who want to. Gender-critical fascists aren't the only ones who pretend to care about violence against people who were AFAB whilst causing it themselves. Cis feminists and the, again, broadly white trans community have both spent decades feeding the myth that Transmascs don't need or deserve protection, support, or consideration. This is the result. A Transmasc person is being passed back and forth like a piece of meat, misgendered as female, given no hope of safety and no choice in the matter, and the press compounded that violence by lying about their gender because they know outrage on behalf of cis women is more profitable. We have all failed Nathan Johnston. A fact that needed to be acknowledged, and I'm sorry for not doing so sooner. I am working on projects to hopefully cultivate a safe environment to explore these topics within our portion of the community, but it's taken me time to rebuild my confidence to the point where I feel strong enough to go against the grain like this. Because what happened last week, on Trans Day of Remembrance no less, gave me a clear reminder of why it's so important to take such a stand. I hope we can all appreciate that and be open to having an honest discussion going forward. Though, what do you think? What are your thoughts on the incident and the new development? How can we better support Transmascs? How else have gender-critical narratives impacted gendered spaces? Did you notice something I missed? Hopefully it's not as major as the last time, but either way, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. I'd also just like to thank Levi for helping me rework this script, particularly on that final chapter. I really appreciate his support. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help keep us running, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make our work possible. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal or super thanks on YouTube. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Goddess a Lighter, Soshula, Wayon 6 Denials, Flynn, and Higgins the Seagull. And for myself, Adita, and Levi, take care now.